To begin with, my name is Tom Boyer. I am a governance consultant. I work primarily with public sector institutions, doing a lot of capacity building work, and also around political processes, which is why I think I was chosen to be the moderator for this particular panel, where we will be looking broadly at data governance and elections. I think this is a theme that is of a lot of importance across the African continent. The sub-themes that we shall be concentrating on is the data and technology in elections. The first thing you'll notice is that this is not a manual. So I think, thank you very much. I wish I could claim credit for that, but I think there were others working very hard behind the scenes to make sure that that was the case. What I'd like to do as we begin, and I think that we have only an hour slotted for this panel, so time is of the essence. Maybe just to give the panel a minute each to introduce themselves, the work that and the work that they're doing, and then we'll be able to move from that straight into this morning's discussion. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Tom. Morning, everyone. My name is Kuda Hove. I work for Privacy International as a policy officer. So what that means is I go to work to look at how the laws and policies that are passed around different countries that we focus on affect the exercise and enjoyment of fundamental rights. And one of our work, or one of our projects, is to look at how technology is affecting the way that people participate in the electoral process, and whether it limits the voices, the voices that they can exercise when they vote, or it promotes that. So that's what I will be discussing as part of my participation on the panel today.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Mallory Nodal. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the Center for Technology and Democracy in Washington, D.C. When I was invited to this panel, I was the head of digital for Article 19 in London, but I've been based in Nairobi for the last several years for personal reasons. But my background is as a technologist and working in human rights and civil society organizations.
Thank you. So my name is Chennai Che, and I am a gender and digital rights research manager. So one of the people who was making the loudest noise about the previous panel, and also a Mozilla Tech Policy Fellow. My background has really been someone who's really interested around the impact of technology on people, so the lived experiences around technology.
Good morning, I'm Isaac Rutenberg, lecturer at Strathmore University Law School, and I am the director of the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law. Published last year the Cyber Law in Kenya, which is a comprehensive textbook on the law in IT law in Kenya.
Thanks very much to all the panelists. I think really the main theme around this panel emerges from the revelations that we've all seen over the last 12 months or so from the role that Cambridge Analytica has played in elections around the world. Here in Kenya, we are no strangers to that conversation. So we're very much aware of the role that data, and particularly personal data, has played in elections. That's something that I have personally been researching over the last few months, working in collaboration with the Hans Seidel Foundation, represented here by Uta and Titus. And so if that's something that's of any interest to anybody here today, please don't hesitate to speak to any one of us at any stage during the proceedings. what we learned very early on, one of our very early learnings, is that people seem to be very, very mesmerized by what we've learned about Cambridge Analytica and what they've been able to accomplish. So much so that we almost get caught up in rehashing what it is that we've learned, rather than trying to think through what might be possible solutions to these methodologies that are now affecting our elections. They do fundamentally undermine the democratic process, and that's a huge challenge. So we need to ascertain whether is this just a reality that we now must face? Is this how the democratic process has evolved, or is there something that we need to be proactively doing so as to be able to ensure that the democratic process is safeguarded? Essentially, we're asking ourselves two main questions. The first being how to uphold the individual right to privacy. And secondly, how do we safeguard democratic politics and democracy in this digital age where actually personal data has been weaponized in a way that it is used to be able to micro-target populations, individuals, and also for commercial and political purposes. With any luck, by the time our panelists today have finished speaking, they will have answered all these questions for us, so we can all sleep much better knowing that all these issues have been dealt with. But to begin today's discussion, I'd like to invite Mallory to give a few remarks.
Thanks. I think I wanted to start off by talking about the larger ecosystem around technology use in elections, which goes beyond electioneering and campaigning. It also goes beyond e-voting machines. In fact, there's so many different moving parts in elections, and today you can imagine there's a technological component to each and every one of them. And the major risks that we are facing in that situation are misinformation, which is alluded to in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, disruption, just whether that be internet access, whether that be some sort of process or procedure in election, changing votes, the fact that voters themselves can sometimes be the thing that is most annoying about the whole thing. And of course, then the adversaries would be, foreign actors, criminal, organized crime, pranksters even. It can be very fun to disrupt large critical infrastructure. Political dissent, of course, can sometimes be used or use voting, and then accidents. Accidents also happen regularly, and it's a risk for sure. And then all the different things or entities or devices involved. You can imagine the voting machines themselves, the servers that are storing the data, the devices that are being used. But then you also have the volunteers, election volunteers who need to be trained, civil servants who can often be a weak point in the process. The voters themselves, as I've already mentioned, can introduce a lot of uncertainty and problems, and then just generally weak protocols and processes. And that is from, of course, before the elections even happen, to all the way to after the elections have occurred, and you're tallying results and you're communicating those results. So there's a lot going on. I'll get a little bit more specific into some of the issues, and maybe there might be some recommendations in here. I don't know. But before, of course, we have the campaigning and social media misinformation, disinformation campaigns, and then what seems to be legitimate, but when you start scratching the surface a bit, in the example of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, it's not really legitimate in electioneering. It's clear misuse of registered voter data and citizen data and so on. And then, of course, you have the registration and the registration process itself. And I'm going to go ahead and speak generally because I don't know very well how the finer details of elections work in Kenya, but also this is a continental event. So I'm going to pass on that one. That's my easy punt on that one. But, a lot of places you have to first register yourself or be known as a voter. And then there are lots of questions that I know Kuda will get into later around data protection of that process. During, you have things like, one of the pillars, one of the very important things to remember about elections is you need to ensure that voters can do it privately and securely. So if there's no trust in the voting process itself, if they're not able to cast their vote in a private and secure manner, then that undermines the whole process. You also need I know it was mentioned earlier today, the idea of using an app to be able to save money, but it's really critical to have voter verifiable paper ballots, even if you use a machine to cast the vote, even if you use the internet to transmit the votes and so on. You need to walk out of the polling station with a verifiable paper ballot. So you have it's like a receipt, yeah? So you need to be able yourself to verify that you voted for the right person, and I'll come to that that later as well. And then generally speaking, the cybersecurity that's needed holistically, including all of these different elements that I've talked about before, is massive. So there's always going to be leaks. That's what cybersecurity is. It's not, I read a tweet the other day. Cybersecurity is not really bailing out your boat. It's more of like, you're really sinking. It's really just like, anyway, I've messed up the metaphor, but I'll find it later. But essentially, it's never going to end. You're never going to be in a state of security. It's a constant process to make sure the cybersecurity is holistically taken care of. And then after, building off of the voter verifiable paper ballots, you also need to be able to prevent recounts, because recounts are very expensive. One way you can prevent them is by doing audits, which are less expensive, but you can't just do nothing. So at the minimum, an audit is a good process, meaning that you sort of insert yourself into one process, you look at it from beginning to end, you look for any inconsistencies, and then you do that in a sort of random small sample way to make sure that the results are sound and that the processes have been clean, I guess, without tampered. So at the end of this session, I want to stop talking now to hand it over to the others on the panel, but I can tweet out some of these resources because there's a lot there, and there's a lot of work that the Center for Democracy and Technology has done on this, especially in the US, but I think those lessons are large and comprehensive enough to translate to other countries and just to think about some of the issues. I don't think that there will be a DEF CON or a Black Hat this year. These are hacker conferences that happen in the US because of the coronavirus, but almost every year there is it's like a contest to see who can hack the voting machines the fastest. Have you heard this and they can do it within minutes, honestly. You give a group of hackers in Las Vegas a voting machine and it is, you can just watch your clock. It's just minutes before they're able to hack into them. So these are, of course, but that's, with every machine, yeah? So it's just to know that, to reinforce that these things are quite fallible, but the antidote is actually robust protocols and processes in the analog world that will actually help to mitigate them.
Thanks very much, Mallory. You did tell us before the session that you were likely to depress us because you enjoy analyzing risks. I guess one of those realities is the fact that across the African continent, we're trying to move to more technology in elections in the hope that this will streamline our elections and reduce the kind of events that we've seen in the past, election rigging, election malpractice. So I think it presents us with a little bit of a conundrum. But as you say, and actually as Lauren put it yesterday, one of the reasons that I'm particularly encouraged by this particular conference and festival is that I strongly believe, like Lauren, that these solutions to these challenges will come from Africa. Africa isn't thinking about solutions for African problems. I think we're going to be able to find solution to global problems. And looking around at the capacity within this room and throughout the last couple of days of this conference, I'm absolutely convinced that that's the case. Moving on to our next speaker, I'll ask Kuda to go ahead and give his remarks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I'll be speaking really around how the issues that Mallory has pointed out can be communicated to people, because ultimately at the end of the day, it's people that are affected. It's their data that's being used. It's their data that's being more or less weaponized against them, so that the way that they vote, the way that they practice their political expression is sort of manipulated and favors one party over the other. So to start off with, when we talk about data and the election process, the capturing of information, the capturing of data is not something new. It's not something that's currently developed because we now have computers, we now have the internet, and we now have biometric voter registration. Back in the day, we used to have paper-based voter registration where you bring some sort of ID, your information is captured. It's captured whether it's in an Excel sheet, whether it's in a physical paper, but it was physically captured on a piece of paper. That is then reproduced and sent to the various polling stations and constituencies where elections are being held. But computers have then sort of automated that process, and they've also allowed, most recently, the capture of more information. So back in the day where the information really involved your name, your date of birth, your place of birth, and things like that, now it involves greater information, including your face, your fingerprints, some places even your iris scan, which is then where we start talking about biometric voter registration, where the registration process now involves the capture of information that is derived or taken from either your eye, your finger, or your face. And someone mentioned yesterday, I think it was Alice, and she said that if we bring together information, we are placing that information in a vulnerable place, and it's only a matter of time and resources or skill until it's hacked. So that's the first risk that's there. And as people in the room that work around different angles, around data protection, around the integrity of the electoral process, the first thing that we should, I think, or I believe, communicate to people is that this information that they are giving away is not just your face. It's not just your fingerprints. It's not just your iris scans. It's actually information that's valuable and information that can be monetized. And then we look at the Cambridge Analytica example and other examples of elections over the past 5 or so years, mainly the US elections, where there's been a lot of talk around Russian involvement in the elections. We now see for the first time with the instance where data or information about voters is actually manipulated in a way that pushes voters to vote in a certain way. So a good example of this is the Brexit vote. When people went out to vote for Brexit, they voted to leave the European Union. But then a bit later, after the vote was held, another informal poll was taken, and people actually said, had we known what we know now, we would not have voted for Brexit. And there were even calls for, let's redo the vote, let's retake the vote and everything. The only difference is that in the run-up to Brexit, a lot of specific and targeted advertising was pushed to voters and potential voters or registered voters. And it wasn't advertising that informed people factually. It was actually advertising. So if, for example, my online profile, depending on the browsing that I have, depending on the sites that I visit, depending on the purchases that I make, indicated that I was a conservative Christian, it would then tilt advertising towards maybe something that I identify with. It would, for example, say, if you don't want more homosexuals coming into the UK, for example, then vote for this party. And that's an example that really resonates with my profile. And in that process, I'm manipulated. It's really a use of data in a very harmful way. And we are seeing this being replicated across the world. It's no longer a North or global North problem or a Western problem. There are reports that Kenya, Cambridge Analytica was even involved in Kenyan elections. So and that in itself shows that it's so pervasive, it's so unnoticeable that people are manipulated without them even knowing. So I think the first thing that we need to do as techies, as policy people, as workers in this space is to show how it's not just information about me as a voter that's being captured, but let's also extend the conversation in easily understood language to show how this data can even be used against us, and also show how we can take steps to prevent this manipulation, to take steps to prevent the exploitation of our data against us. Because the minute that someone is manipulated into voting for a specific party, that person has really lost their political expression. They are voting based on bad information or manipulated information, whereas the right to free expression depends on the right to be able to access accurate, timely information that then informs your decision. I would say in brief, that's what I have to say, and then we can discuss further as we go on.
Thank you very much, Kuda. I think the main message coming from that is the issue of sensitization and ensuring that the citizen understands just how valuable their data is and the rationale for protecting that data. I know too many of us, and I'm probably as guilty as anybody else, very freely download all manner of apps on your phones without considering what it is, particularly free apps. Many of them which are simply harvesting your data, and probably in some cases then that data is being shared with third parties and is then available for either commercial or political purposes. And again, not to look too much at Cambridge Analytica in particular, but again, some of the early learnings that we've had in the research that we have been carrying out is that even though Cambridge Analytica no longer exists as an entity, one of the results of the fall of Cambridge Analytica is that there's now probably 100 of them, of little Cambridge Analyticas all over the place, doing the same thing. Why? Because it's proven to be extremely effective. And so for the political class, not only here in Africa, but across the globe, their services will be sought. Their services will be sought, and so this is a reality that we need to find some way to address. Next up from the panel, I'll invite Chennai with one N to give her remarks.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I can see people are like searching to see if what applications they have on their phones and collecting what data. So that's quite great. Practical application of the panel. So I think what's already been set up by my previous speakers is actually what do we expect from citizens? The role and responsibility of citizens when it comes to trying to at least protect their data around misinformation, or for it to be used to be manipulated, to manipulate their vote. So last week I attended an elections management body meeting, and apart from all the regulators trying to get the internet shut down, there were some interesting insights on what would be, the questions that emerged were, what are the citizens' responsibilities and how do we equip them to be, in order for them to control their data? And I think one of the issues that really came up for me, which I thought was a practical example, is firstly, to what extent do we have control over this data on these platforms? And I think even our data practices, we rely on connecting to third-party applications through social media, Facebook in particular, because it's quite convenient and it's easy. That's one of the login options that they give you when you go on the platform. So then the question then that emerged was, how then do we, address this privacy issue? There was a campaign, I think, post, once again, Cambridge Analytica, where it was delete Facebook. Now, in our context, in our African context, a lot of people go on the internet for the first time to make use of social media. Now, imagine starting a citizen awareness campaign where you're saying delete Facebook, and we're in a context where internet access and use is very expensive, communication is very expensive, and it's cheaper to communicate via Messenger or to send to comment on someone's Facebook post. So that suggestion in our particular context is quite problematic. So then the next suggestion that actually from the, I think, Electronic Freedom Frontier, what they put together was a suggestion where you would have to curate your social media platforms to see who has access to which third-party applications had access to your Facebook profile. And this is mainly games and other platforms. And I think I used to be on Facebook. I have the privilege to delete my Facebook account. And in particular, I had Candy Crush. At one time, I had Candy Crush on every platform, and it was quite easy. I don't know what data they were collecting at that time. But I do know that, for example, my Pinterest was connected to my Facebook. And I was always surprised at how much, you leave Pinterest to get one particular collage for your bedroom. The next thing you know, you're getting all of these color palettes that work for you. So it's as much as the convenience associated with these platforms, there's a need to curate our presence online in terms of what platforms have access to our social media accounts. And then going on to the last practical example, I think when Alice this morning mentioned the need to use Firefox, it was more also to do with the fact that actually they created a container. So this the Mozilla Firefox Facebook container, if you look it up online, you actually get much more description on it. But what it does, it actually enables users to have more control of their data. So then it addresses that issue of we can't necessarily say everyone get off Facebook. But what it does is that it allows for it makes it harder for Facebook to track your activity and on other third-party websites, which then does allow for them to build that aggregate profile of the kind of things that you want, and other data companies can take and manipulate your vote in that instance. So I think those are some of the practical solutions that are already existent, but I do believe that as you pointed out, we actually need to come out with solutions around how do we ensure that we have more control of our data as much as we can. And I think it's also raising citizens' awareness that your data is being aggregated beyond your personal information that's being protected in the data protection system to be used against you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chennai. And I think taking sensitization to the next step in terms of thinking about how we manage our online presence. And again, I think too many of us probably don't give it a second thought and very, very freely download and engage with whatever we feel like on the internet. But it's clear that there are interested parties out there who are very interested in your data. There are data brokers who their entire business model is based around collecting your data and selling it commercially to other parties. So it's very much in all of our best interest to think about how we manage our online presence. Before we take a round of questions, we'll have the last presentation from Isaac.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before I get to the election-specific stuff, I'll talk a bit generally. I'm going to guess, although in my class I would have you raise your hand and maybe pick on you, I'm going to guess that many of you have logged into the Wi-Fi here. I'm going to further guess, okay, good for some. I'm going to further guess that you all agreed to the terms and conditions, and none of you read the terms and conditions. I did read the terms and conditions, and I found them surprising in two ways. One is it says in the terms and conditions to which you have access, they do monitor outgoing email. And it's unclear whether that means the content of the email or just the volume, but they say that they do monitor outgoing email, which I find very interesting. And secondly, they have a section that says on data privacy, and they say if you would like to read their policy on data privacy, which is incorporated by reference, you have to click a link. I clicked the link and it took me to a dead page. So you can't even get to the data privacy policy of the hotel in which you're using the Wi-Fi, which I find we are entirely too lax about this, and I find that's a failure on many levels in different ways. So now moving on, in that light, moving on to data in the context of the election, we know a couple of things for sure, and I'll preface this with 2 points of data. First of all, in 2017, the Kenyan voter register was available for purchase. underhandedly. Of course, it wasn't illegal to do that. It wasn't legal to do that. But if you wanted the voter register, you could get it. We knew this because it was offered to us, and a number of other people told us that they did buy it. And so, of course, we didn't buy it because it would have been illegal for us to do that. But the fact remained that it was possible to buy the voter registry. Second point of data is just this year we learned that the Israeli voter register, 6.5 million Israeli voters, the entire register was available for download because they were using an app that had a security flaw. So if Israel can't figure this stuff out, the point of that is that we should get away from this idea that we can have a flawless system, that we can secure the voter registry, that we can secure any data, pretty much any data. It is impossible to do so, and we should, instead of looking at how do we put in place the laws, or what we should definitely do that, but in addition to looking at how we put in place laws and policies and frameworks, we should also look at what do we do in the event of a breach, the inevitable breach. It will happen. And so, I mean, one thing I would suggest perhaps is we don't aggregate all of the data into one gigantic valuable database, which makes it even more, first of all, more something that hackers or others would want to access even more, and second of all, even more damaging to the people once the data is lost. So we should think about that. Now, I'll talk about two other issues in addition to that. First is, and I hope I don't come across as picking on organizations or people or anything. I'm saying I offer this as a suggestion for how we can improve. First, I'll look at the judiciary. In 2017, the election case involved an awful lot of technology. This was predicted before the election happened, and in fact came true that the Supreme Court case on the presidential petition did involve quite a lot of technology. And there's the famous statement of "open the servers" from the litigants, which is actually a bit nonsensical, but it kind of showed a little bit of what people are thinking. What was submitted to the courts was dozens and dozens of pages of database access logs. And if you look at database access logs, they are pretty much gibberish unless you know what you're doing, unless you have a technology background. And so to expect a court with very little technical training to understand that is nonsense. It's insane. They can't. And so they need help. They absolutely need help. But the ability, the facilities for helping are limited. The amicus curiae is not a very well-established thing here. There is not a very well-established mechanism for a judge who says, I need help with this, understanding this technology to be able to get it. And the evidence for that can be, I'll point to the most recent Huduma case that came out, the decision. As the judges were reading the decision, they said, we were overwhelmed by the technology and didn't understand this. And so we made the decision not based on that, but on other aspects. Unfortunately, you can't divorce those two. You can't divorce technology from the policy, from the way things happen in society. These things are now so interlinked that, and particularly when it comes to elections, you cannot do that. And so you need a judiciary that has, if not the technical capacity themselves, at least the ability to access the expertise in an impartial manner. And finally, I'll mention the media. To some degree, all of this goes back to citizenry education. And you know, as citizens, we really have very limited things we can do, right? Like you can either get on the Wi-Fi here or not, right? You can't say, oh, I object to Blue Radisson using my, looking at my emails, but I still want access to the Wi-Fi. You can't do that, right? So we have a very limited ability to influence what we actually engage with from technology perspective. Nevertheless, knowing what the situation is, knowing what is fake news and is not fake news, knowing all of these things is really important, and that really falls down to the media to have one, a level of independence, which I think is not present, and two, a level of technology savvy, which is somewhat present, and three, a level of engagement in the sense of fact-checking, going out and actually determining what is the truth. I think that until we have those aspects in the media, it will be very difficult to ensure an election that is, as fair as we hope it would be.